Supreme Mother Earth. The issue is the climate. And the question is, will the Supreme Court decision on the EPA reduce our advances in combating climate change?
Welcome to Political Playlist.
All right, are we ready, guys?
Happy hour.
Happy hour.
We fucked that up so bad.
What up, tree hugging lovers? It's Michael from Political Playlist coming at you from another happy hour. Here we are with the gang. What's up, guys?
Good afternoon, Michael. How are you?
Good.
Good morning. I can't put on glasses. Good morning.
It's Chic Anna coming to you from the runway of Block Island. Are you there for Fashion Week?
Oui.
She's also taking French, folks. So how do you say look out?
Oui, je prof. Attendre. No, that's wait.
Caution.
Well, anyways, if you guys want to sit here and dilly-dally the entire time, we could do that. But people got things to do. People got places to go.
And just a quick apology to our viewers here. You know, Anna is on Safari/Recess as well. She doesn't have great internet, so forgive her video if it's a little choppy.
Was that bad when I was talking?
Oh,
I
so
heard
bad.
you. I heard you perfectly clear.
Maybe you should go blank and we should put an emoji there.
Just like a weird photo of me. Should I just take a still of this?
Yes, there it is. Well, let's get to it here, gang. 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court ruled on a case which drastically will limit the EPA, that's the Environmental Protection Agency's, ability to regulate carbon emissions from power plants. So this decision is obviously going to make it increasingly harder for the Biden administration to carry out one of its major climate initiatives, which is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by half at the end of the decade. So the vote on this was 6-3. Unsurprising, the liberals were in the dissent. It's coming on the heels of two mega court decisions that we've already seen in the last 3 weeks. One that expanded gun rights to gun owners. And the second being, of course, what we've talked about, the overturning of Roe v. Wade. So this is quite the sort of bombshell of a way to end this court term. Before we get into the politics of all this, which there's a lot to dive into there, can you first kind of walk us through just what exactly this decision means in practical terms and help us make sense of it all?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, I want to say the Supreme Court is on recess till October. So, thank nice. God. And yeah, seriously, must be nice. But everyone's mental health might be at a better state over the next couple months.
Yeah.
But
thank God.
Also, how do we get a job where we get like 3 months that are called recess?
Also, I think they get way longer.
Teacher.
Yeah.
Michael.
But this really stems from a 1970 Clean Air Act law that was passed. What this really draws back to was an Obama era regulatory framework, which was passed under the Clean Power Plan. And it was basically, this was passed to reduce, to fight climate change and reduce carbon pollution from coal-fired power plants. So this was setting individual goals for each state to cut power plant emissions and direct companies to do that as well, especially related to coal-fired power plants. What's important to know is this has never gone into effect yet. So it is pretty crazy that the Supreme Court took this case up, because what the right is saying is the EPA should not have the power to be enforcing something like this.
On the state level.
So the dissent opinion was actually saying that there was no reason for the court to take up this decision, because it looks like Biden was actually going to issue a new ruling separate from the Clean Power Plan and the Affordable Clean Energy Rule.
Well, and typically, doesn't the Supreme Court usually tend to wait for a law to be implemented before it agrees to hear an appeal of it? So that is also what Chief Justice talked about. Was first they had to even figure out if they could put a ruling on this, because it wasn't a law yet. Right.
It wasn't in effect yet. So When Trump came into office, he immediately replaced Obama's regulation with the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which gave states and power plants more flexibility to comply with the rules.
I think that what's interesting about that is I was reading just this whole thing about kind of where the Supreme Court is going and how specifically Justice Thomas has sort of the power that he's been trying to find his entire career. He finally is getting it. And one of the big ways is this attempt by the more conservative justices to really take on federal regulatory agencies. Mm-hmm. So I think it's kind of interesting because I feel like when you said, they gave the power back to the states, it's like that's exactly what they're saying happened in reversing Roe v. Wade. And so it's kind of an interesting pattern of taking on these federal laws and then repackaging them in language that is more state by state friendly. And it seems like that's kind of a mission of this conservative majority court.
And I think what's interesting, Anthony, is, to that counter argument, a lot on the left are saying how, in response to, well, if you want the EPA to regulate these greenhouse gas emissions, Congress has to give them that directive. A lot on the left are saying, well, Congress gave them that directive by creating an organization called the Environmental Protection Agency. That was the directive that Congress gave. So this idea that, okay, the EPA doesn't have jurisdiction over that, it then sort of, in my mind, begs the question, okay, well then, does the FBI have jurisdiction over domestic terrorism? Because the Congress didn't appoint the FBI specifically to go after domestic terrorism. And the list goes on if we want to play this, well, what about game? You know what I mean?
You hit the nail perfectly on the head, Michael.
So smart. So smart, Michael.
Guys, I never win. What's the prize?
Yeah.
I don't know. You're just doing so well these days.
Been doing
really
you're
weird.
You're,
so much. I started doing Legree, and I've taken up Latin.
As Michael said, the right is arguing this is not a climate change issue. It's actually about limiting bureaucracy and authority.
Yeah.
Can you guys guess what happened after this came out? What our young politicians may have done? What do you think of the first thing they did?
Tweet storm.
Tweet.
They wrote a letter.
I have a question. Is this letter from Mike Levin?
Yes, it is. Yeah, who used to be an environmental lawyer, right? He's a congressman congressman from California. Yeah. Anna, how about you tell us a little bit about this letter?
Sure. Well, basically, Mike led a letter that was actually sent the day before the decision came down. So basically, they were anticipating this ruling. And what they said was asking the EPA to enact a series of executive actions that the EPA would still be allowed to do under this new ruling. And it listed out in every area of climate change, whether it was greenhouse gases, whether it was clean water, all of these different environmental concern areas. It gave the EPA very specific actions to take, and all aimed at lowering emissions standards and dealing with the effects of climate change. And so actually there was a couple other of our young politicians we cover who signed on. One of them being Nanette Diaz-Barragán, who represents a district in Southern California that has really, really unhealthy air conditions. Another being Rashida Tlaib, who represents a district in Michigan that is one of the poorest in the country. And then also Darren Soto, who is a Democrat from Florida, who represents a district, I believe near Orlando, that deals with a whole host of environmental issues in Florida. So these are all people who are dealing with the environment and the implications of specifically air and water pollution on a daily basis.
So what's interesting about that letter that I was very surprised about was there were only 30 people who signed on to that. I would think that more of our young Democratic politicians would have been on that letter, which makes me think that they don't feel this decision is that important either.
One of the, I think, party lines of the right, no pun intended, is that the EPA is incompetent. They never have the right things or ideas or solutions. And what you're saying sort of further backs up that point of, well, here the EPA, the data that they're relying on is actually unreliable, whether it be through outdated technology or what have you.
Yes. And here is where I'm going to take this from a higher view here, of where we're really going to help save the climate here is private industries are already starting to take the torch and lead the way. But the issue is government has to step in at some point and say, hey, we really need you to go a little bit faster. So, one of the main things that has happened over the last, 10 years is sustainability reports. Companies never issued sustainability. I mean, some have been doing it for 20 plus years, but most companies have never done that. Companies are starting to do that. So there's a group of private companies that have taken the lead. They see the writing on the wall. They see something like this, when Obama came in and had that rule put in, or the SEC recently, a couple of years, putting climate disclosures in, the reporting system. Companies say, hey, I want to be a good steward for the climate. I'm going to do this.
So it sounds to me like the government is not doing as good of a job when it comes to data, but the government acts as a very good facilitator for framework in which all companies can begin to participate in this fight to reduce climate change.
Yeah.
And do you think that this decision specifically at the Supreme Court, which a lot of people are sounding the alarm about, which is talking about specifically emissions from power plants, the government's ability to dictate emissions from power plants in individual states, do you think that that is going to affect the government's ability to provide that framework? Or do you think that state regulatory agencies will do a good enough job on their own?
Great question, Anna. God, sometimes I think you are one of the smarter ones of this three. But
I have notes.
We know it's all good.
Yes. So I think what's going to happen to this is there are going to be states who take massive leadership, and it's going to end up being many of the blue states, but you're also seeing some red states actually do that right now. There's been recent regulation passed in Tennessee, of all places, that is talking about how pipelines and gas should be measured and looked at. So obviously blue states will lead the way in this because climate change is a bigger issue to them. Colorado is one of the leaders. They are the leader in measuring methane emissions for a state.
Yeah.
The reason we're talking about all this is not because of something Congress did. It's because of something the Supreme Court did. And we are seeing just how activist a judge these far right Republican appointed judges are turning out to be, which ironically is something the Democrats have always been accused of, trying to stack the court with activist judges by the right. And now we're kind of seeing them do that to a degree that I don't think we've seen the court do in quite a while. And the second is that they've now ruled on three major cases that go very contrary to the major polling data that shows where Americans are on these issues. And so what we're seeing now is just how much legislating from the bench this court is doing. The Supreme Court is now just another political branch of government.
When I was looking into this letter, I came across a stat that I think is just a poignant place to maybe end this. Because yes, there's all these politics, and yes, there's the politicization of the court and how actually functional the EPA is and whatever. But the American Lung Association released a stat that more than 40% of Americans are living in places with unhealthy levels of air pollution. We get caught up in the regulation and federal agencies versus state, like self-policing and whatever. But the reality is 40% of Americans have bad air. And that's in the wealthiest and one of the most developed countries in the world. So that to me kind of says it all. And like, that's the thing that people should be focusing on.